I never thought I'd find myself in this situation. 6 years of marriage, and here I was, sitting in the passenger seat of our old Chevy, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Gabriel, my husband, was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had turned white. We were driving back from my mom's place, and what should have been a quiet ride home had turned into something I never saw coming. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It would have been beautiful if I wasn't so focused on the storm brewing inside our car. I could feel it coming, like that moment just before a thunderclap when the air goes still and you know something big is about to happen. Enough of this back and forth, Maria, Gabriel suddenly barked, breaking the silence that had stretched between us since we left my mom's. Either you sign the house over to me, or our relationship ends here and now. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The house he was talking about wasn't just any property. It was my grandparents' old villa, the one overlooking the sea in Santa Barbara. My mom had left it to me in her will, and it was more than just bricks and mortar. It was memories, it was family, it was home. Gabriel had been pestering me for months to put it in his name. He kept saying it was just for tax reasons, but I'm not stupid. I'd started to suspect his real intentions the day he began spending late nights at the office and dodging my questions about our finances. My refusal to pass my legacy to him wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about principles, respect, and trust. And right now, sitting in that car, I realized just how little of those things remained between us. I turned to look at him, trying to see if there was any trace left of the man I'd fallen in love with. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. In that moment, I made a decision. Never, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The car screeched to a halt so suddenly I was thrown forward, the seatbelt digging into my chest. We were on some abandoned stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean a distant glimmer in the fading light. Before I could catch my breath, Gabriel was out of the car, stomping around to my side. He yanked open the passenger door. "Get out," he yelled, his face contorted with anger. "You think you're smarter than me? Figure out your way home." I sat there, frozen, unable to believe what was happening. Was this really the man I'd shared my life with for the past 6 years? The man who'd promised to love and cherish me? In that moment, it was like I was seeing him for the first time, and I didn't recognize him at all. Somehow, I managed to unbuckle my seatbelt and step out of the car. My legs felt wobbly, like they might give out at any moment. But I was determined not to let him see me cry. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. As soon as my feet hit the asphalt, Gabriel slammed the car door shut. He stormed back to the driver's side, got in, and without so much as a backward glance, he roared off into the distance, leaving me alone in the gathering darkness. I stood there, watching the taillights of our car disappear around a bend in the road. The enormity of what had just happened started to sink in. My husband had just abandoned me on the side of the highway. Over a house. Over money. Over control. The sun had fully set now, and the temperature was dropping fast. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly aware of how exposed I was out here. The Pacific Coast Highway could be dangerous at night, especially for a woman alone. I needed to start moving, to find help, to get home. But for a moment, I just stood there, letting the sound of the distant waves wash over me. As I started walking, my mind raced with thoughts and memories. I thought about the day Gabriel and I met, at a friend's barbecue in Malibu. He'd been so charming, so attentive. We'd stayed up all night talking, watching the sun rise over the ocean. I remembered our wedding day, how happy and in love we'd been. When had things started to go wrong? When had the man I loved turned into this stranger who could leave me stranded on the side of the road? The first car that passed me didn't stop. Neither did the second or the third. I kept walking, my heels clicking against the asphalt, the sound echoing in the quiet night. Each step I took felt like a step away from my old life and towards, what? I didn't know yet, but I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. As I walked, I thought about my mom. She'd never really warmed up to Gabriel, always saying there was something about him she didn't trust. I'd dismissed her concerns, chalking it up to her being overprotective. Now, I wished more than anything that I could talk to her, that I could ask for her advice. But she was gone, and all I had left of her was the house Gabriel was so desperate to get his hands on. I don't know how long I'd been walking when I heard the sound of a car slowing down behind me. My heart started racing. Was it Gabriel, coming back for me? Had he realized what he'd done and come to apologize? Or was it someone else, someone who might mean me harm? I turned around slowly, shielding my eyes from the glare of headlights. The car came to a stop beside me, and the passenger window rolled down. An older woman leaned out, concern etched on her face. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked. "Do you need a ride?" I hesitated for a moment. My whole life, I'd been taught not to get into cars with strangers. But right now, this kindler-looking woman seemed like my best option. I nodded, relief washing over me. "Yes, please," I said. "If you could just take me to the nearest town, I'd be so grateful." The woman smiled and unlocked the doors. As I climbed in, I noticed a man in the driver's seat, probably her husband. They introduced themselves as Linda and Bob, a retired couple from San Luis Obispo who were on their way back from visiting their grandkids in LA. "What on earth happened to you?" Linda asked as we pulled back onto the highway. "It's not safe for a young woman to be out here alone at night." I didn't know how to explain what had happened without breaking down in tears. So I gave them a simplified version, saying I'd had a fight with my husband and he'd driven off without me. Linda reached over and patted my hand, her touch comforting. "Men can be such idiots sometimes," she said, shooting a playful glare at her husband. Bob just chuckled and kept his eyes on the road. As we drove, Linda kept up a steady stream of chatter, telling me about her grandkids, her garden back home, anything to keep my mind off what had happened. I was grateful for the distraction. It gave me time to think, to start formulating a plan. By the time we reached Santa Barbara, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't go back to the house I shared with Gabriel, not tonight. I gave Linda and Bob the address of my friend Elena instead. They insisted on waiting until I was safely inside before driving off, waving goodbye like they were my own grandparents seeing me off. Elena was shocked when she opened the door and saw me standing there. One look at my face, and she knew something was terribly wrong. She ushered me inside, sat me down on her couch, and poured me a large glass of wine before I told her everything. As I recounted the events of the evening, Elena's expression changed from shock to anger to determination. When I finished, she got up without a word and disappeared into her spare room. She came back with an armful of blankets and pillows. "You're staying here tonight," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And tomorrow, we're going to figure this out. Together." I felt a lump form in my throat at her kindness. For the first time since Gabriel had driven away, I let myself cry. Elena held me as I sobbed, stroking my hair and murmuring words of comfort. That night, as I lay in Elena's guest room, unable to sleep, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let Gabriel's betrayal define me. I wouldn't let him take my grandparents' house, my heritage, my self-respect. Tomorrow was a new day, and I would face it head-on. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I finally drifted off to sleep, my mind filled with plans and possibilities. The road ahead might be long and difficult, but I was ready to walk it. On my own terms, this time. I woke up the next morning in Elena's guest room, momentarily disoriented. For a split second, I forgot where I was and why I was there. Then it all came rushing back: Gabriel's ultimatum, being left on the side of the road, the kind couple who gave me a ride. I sat up, my head pounding, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Elena was already up, the smell of coffee wafting through the apartment. I dragged myself out of bed and into the kitchen, where she was busy making breakfast. "Morning, sunshine," she said, sliding a mug of coffee across the counter to me. "How are you feeling?" I took a sip of the coffee, letting the warmth and caffeine work their magic. "Like my whole life just exploded," I replied honestly. Elena nodded sympathetically. "I bet. But listen, Maria, we're going to figure this out. You're not alone in this." As we ate breakfast, we started to form a plan. The first order of business was to go back to the house and see what was going on there. I was dreading it, but I knew I had to face it sooner or later. We drove over in Elena's car, my stomach in knots the whole way. As we turned onto my street, I half expected to see Gabriel's car in the driveway. But it wasn't there. In fact, the house looked eerily quiet. Maybe he's not home, Elena said, trying to sound optimistic. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We got out of the car and walked up to the front door. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking slightly. When I finally got the door open, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The house was completely empty. Every piece of furniture, every photo frame, every memory of the home I'd fought so hard to preserve, gone. I stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to process what I was seeing. Elena pushed past me, her face a mixture of shock and anger. "What the hell?" she exclaimed, walking from room to room. "Maria, everything's gone." I finally found my voice. "He must have been planning this for weeks," I said, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. "He waited for me to be out, hired movers, and stripped the house bare." Elena came back to the living room, her face flushed with anger. "This isn't just wrong, Maria. It's illegal. He can't just take everything like this." I nodded, a strange calm settling over me. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a smoldering anger. "You're right," I said. "And he's not going to get away with it." We spent the next few hours taking stock of what was missing and making phone calls. I called our bank and put a freeze on our joint accounts. Elena helped me contact a lawyer who specialized in divorce cases. By the end of the day, I felt like I'd run a marathon, but at least I had a plan. As evening approached, Elena had to leave for work. She was a nurse at the local hospital and had a night shift. She was reluctant to leave me alone, but I assured her I'd be okay. "Are you sure?" she asked for the 100th time as she gathered her things. "You could come stay at my place again." I shook my head. "No, I need to be here. This is my home, and I'm not letting Gabriel drive me out of it." After Elena left, I sat on the floor of the empty living room, my back against the wall, and let myself really feel everything that had happened. The anger, the betrayal, the fear, I let it all wash over me. But underneath it all, there was something else. A determination I hadn't felt in years. I thought back to the woman I used to be before I met Gabriel. I'd been independent, strong-willed, full of dreams and ambitions. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost that part of myself. Well, it was time to find her again. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the empty room, I made a decision. I wasn't going to just sit here and wait for Gabriel to make the next move. I was going to take control of the situation. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. It was for Carlos, an old friend from college who'd become a private investigator. I'd thought about calling him weeks ago when I first started suspecting Gabriel was up to something, but I'd talked myself out of it. Not this time. The phone rang a few times before Carlos picked up. "Maria," he said, sounding surprised. "It's been a while. How are you?" I took a deep breath. "Carlos, I need your help. It's about my husband, Gabriel. I think he's been up to something, and I need to know what." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Carlos spoke again, his voice was all business. "Tell me everything," he said. For the next hour, I told Carlos everything. My suspicions about Gabriel's late nights and secretive behavior, the ultimatum about the house, being abandoned on the side of the road, coming home to find everything gone. Carlos listened without interrupting, only occasionally asking for clarification. When I finished, there was another long pause. "Maria," Carlos finally said, "I'm so sorry you're going through this. But you did the right thing by calling me. I can help." We spent the next half hour discussing strategy. Carlos explained that he'd need to do some digging, bank records, phone records, surveillance. It wouldn't be cheap, but I didn't care. I needed answers. "One more thing," Carlos said before we hung up. "I'm going to send my partner, Victor, over to your place tonight. Just to keep an eye on things. Is that okay?" I hesitated for a moment. The thought of a stranger watching my house should have been unsettling, but instead, it made me feel safer. "Yes," I said. "That would be great. Thank you, Carlos." After hanging up with Carlos, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like I was taking positive action. I wasn't just reacting to Gabriel's moves anymore, I was making my own. As night fell, I moved through the empty house, making mental notes of everything that was missing. In the kitchen, I found a few plates and glasses Gabriel had overlooked. I made myself a simple dinner and ate standing at the counter, my mind racing with plans and possibilities. Just as I was finishing up, there was a soft knock at the door. I tensed for a moment, then remembered, it must be Victor, Carlos's partner. I went to the door and opened it cautiously. Victor was a tall, lean man with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. He introduced himself and explained that he'd be keeping watch from his car parked down the street. If I needed anything, I just had to flash the porch lights twice. As I closed the door behind Victor, I felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, it was surreal to think that I needed someone to keep watch over my own home. On the other hand, it made me feel protected, like I wasn't facing this alone. That night, as I lay on a makeshift bed of blankets on the living room floor, I couldn't help but think about how much my life had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, I'd been a wife, living what I thought was a normal life. Now, I was, what? A soon-to-be divorcee? A victim of theft? A woman on a mission for justice? I tossed and turned, my mind replaying every moment of my relationship with Gabriel, looking for clues I might have missed. When had things started to go wrong? Had there been signs I'd ignored? Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. I woke up early the next morning, my body aching from sleeping on the hard floor. But despite the physical discomfort, I felt more clear-headed than I had in months. As I made myself a cup of coffee in the near-empty kitchen, I started to form a to-do list in my head. First, I needed to secure my finances. I'd frozen the joint accounts, but I needed to open new ones in my name only. Then, I needed to start the process of formally separating from Gabriel. As much as it hurt to admit it, our marriage was over. Finally, I needed to start rebuilding my life, my home, my career, my sense of self. As I sipped my coffee, watching the sun rise over the Pacific from my kitchen window, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be hard, no doubt about it. But I was stronger than Gabriel gave me credit for. He thought he could break me, leave me stranded and helpless. But he'd underestimated me. I was done being a victim. From now on, I was going to be the hero of my own story. And the first chapter of that story started right here, right now, in this empty house that held so many memories. It was time to make some new ones, on my own terms. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and paperwork. I felt like I was living someone else's life, going through motions that didn't quite feel real. But with each step I took to reclaim my life, I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. Elena had been a godsend, helping me navigate the practical aspects of my new reality. She'd even convinced her brother, who worked in IT, to come over and sweep the house for hidden cameras or recording devices. We didn't find anything, but it was a relief to know for sure. Carlos and Victor had been busy too. They'd set up discreet surveillance on Gabriel, tracking his movements and trying to piece together what he'd been up to. I was both eager and terrified to hear what they'd found out. It was a week after Gabriel had left me on the side of the road when Carlos called, asking if we could meet. "I have some information," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I think you should hear it in person." We arranged to meet at a small cafe in downtown Santa Barbara. It was a place I used to love, known for its amazing pastries and quiet atmosphere. As I walked in, the familiar smell of coffee and freshly baked bread hit me, bringing back memories of lazy Sunday mornings with Gabriel. I pushed the thought away and scanned the room for Carlos. He was sitting in a corner booth, a manila folder on the table in front of him. As I slid into the seat across from him, I noticed the lines of tension around his eyes. Whatever he had to tell me, it wasn't good news. "Maria," he said, his voice gentle. "Before we start, I want you to know that what I'm about to tell you, it's not easy to hear. But knowledge is power, and you need to know what we've uncovered." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I'm ready," I said. "Tell me everything." Carlos opened the folder and started laying out documents on the table. Bank statements, property records, photographs. As he explained each piece of evidence, I felt my world tilting on its axis once again. Gabriel, it turned out, had been living a double life for years. He'd been siphoning money from our joint accounts into a private fund under a fake name. He'd made secret trips to meet with a woman. Carlos showed me surveillance photos of them together, looking intimate and happy. And perhaps most shocking of all, he'd been planning to sell my grandparents' villa without my knowledge or consent. "We think he was planning to disappear," Carlos said, his voice low. "Take the money, sell the house, and vanish with the other woman." I sat there, staring at the evidence of my husband's betrayal spread out before me. I should have felt devastated, destroyed. But instead, I felt calm. Like the final piece of a puzzle had clicked into place. "Thank you, Carlos," I said, my voice steady, "for uncovering all of this. I know it couldn't have been easy." Carlos looked at me, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you okay, Maria? I know this is a lot to take in." I nodded, surprising myself with how composed I felt. "I'm okay. Actually, I'm better than okay. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I can see things clearly." We spent the next hour discussing our next steps. Carlos had enough evidence to not only ensure I kept the villa, but also to potentially press charges against Gabriel for financial fraud. It was a lot to consider, and I told Carlos I needed some time to think about how I wanted to proceed. As I left the cafe, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Yes, my marriage was over. Yes, the man I thought I knew had turned out to be a stranger. But now I knew the truth, and that knowledge was power. I decided to walk home, needing the time to clear my head and process everything I'd learned. The Santa Barbara streets were bustling with life, tourists snapping photos, locals going about their day, surfers heading to the beach with boards under their arms. Life was going on all around me, and I realized that mine would too. As I approached my street, I saw a familiar car parked in front of my house. My heart skipped a beat. It was Gabriel's car. For a moment, I considered turning around, calling Carlos or Elena for backup. But then I squared my shoulders. No, I thought. This is my house, my life. I'm not running away. I walked up to the front door, my key already in hand. As I opened it, I heard movement inside. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty rooms. Gabriel appeared in the hallway, looking disheveled and angry. "Maria," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and contempt. "I didn't expect you to be here." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "This is my house, Gabriel. Where else would I be?" He scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "Your house. Come on, Maria. We both know this place is as good as mine. You're just being stubborn." I felt a flash of anger, but I pushed it down. Getting emotional wouldn't help me now. Instead, I looked at him calmly, really looked at him. The man standing before me wasn't the Gabriel I'd fallen in love with. This was someone else entirely, someone desperate, cornered. "Why are you here, Gabriel?" I asked, keeping my voice level. He started pacing, his agitation evident. "I came to get the rest of my things. And to give you one last chance to be reasonable about this house situation." I almost laughed. One last chance. As if he was doing me a favor. "I think we're past that point, don't you?" I said. "Especially considering what I now know about your extracurricular activities." Gabriel froze, his eyes widening slightly. "What are you talking about?" I walked over to the kitchen counter where I'd left my purse. I pulled out a copy of one of the photos Carlos had shown me, a clear shot of Gabriel with his arm around another woman, both of them smiling at each other. I held it up for him to see. The color drained from Gabriel's face. For a moment, he looked like he might try to deny it, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. "How did you?" he started to ask. "That doesn't matter," I cut him off. "What matters is that I know everything, Gabriel. The secret accounts, the plans to sell the house, all of it." He stared at me, a mixture of shock and something else. Was it respect? In his eyes. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. "Yes, you did," I agreed. "Now, I think it's time for you to leave. And don't come back." My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce proceedings. Gabriel opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. Without another word, he walked past me and out the door. I listened as his car started up and drove away, the sound fading into the distance. As silence settled over the empty house once more, I let out a long breath. My hands were shaking, I realized. The confrontation had taken more out of me than I'd thought. I walked through the rooms, taking stock of what was left. Gabriel hadn't taken anything this time, probably because he knew I was onto him. The house still felt hollow, but not in the same way as before. Now, it felt like a blank canvas, ready for a fresh start. I ended up in the living room, standing by the large windows that overlooked the ocean. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It reminded me of that fateful evening when Gabriel had left me on the side of the road. But this time, instead of feeling lost and alone, I felt free. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Elena. How did the meeting with Carlos go? Do you need anything? I smiled, feeling a rush of gratitude for my friend. I typed out a quick reply. It went well. Lots to tell you. Can you come over? As I waited for Elena's response, I realized something. This empty house wasn't a symbol of what I'd lost. It was a symbol of all the possibilities that lay ahead. It was time to start filling it again, not with reminders of my past with Gabriel, but with new memories, new dreams. My phone buzzed again. Elena was on her way. I took one last look at the sunset, then turned away from the window. I had a future to start planning. Elena arrived about half an hour later, armed with a bottle of wine and a determined look on her face. As soon as she walked in, she pulled me into a tight hug. Okay, spill, she said as she released me. What did Carlos find out? We settled on the floor of the living room, our backs against the wall, the open wine bottle between us. I took a deep breath and began to recount everything Carlos had told me. Elena listened intently, her expressions shifting from shock to anger to disbelief. That lying, cheating scumbag, she muttered when I finished. I can't believe he was planning to sell your grandparents' house. I nodded, taking a sip of wine. I know. It's like. I thought I knew him, you know? But it turns out I didn't know him at all. Elena reached out and squeezed my hand. You couldn't have known, Maria. He fooled everyone, not just you. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelations hanging in the air between us. Then Elena straightened up, a determined glint in her eye. So, what's the plan? She asked. Please tell me you're going to take him for everything he's worth. I couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. I'm not sure yet, I admitted. Carlos said we have enough evidence to press charges for financial fraud. But part of me just wants to be done with it all, you know? To move on with my life. Elena nodded thoughtfully. I get that. But Maria, think about it. What he did, it's not just about you. What if he does this to someone else? You have a chance to stop him. Her words hit me hard. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd been so focused on my own pain, my own journey, that I hadn't considered the bigger picture. You're right, I said slowly. I need to think about this carefully. We spent the rest of the evening talking, strategizing, and yes, finishing that bottle of wine. By the time Elena left, I felt more centered, more sure of my path forward. The next morning, I woke up early, my mind clear despite the wine from the night before. I knew what I had to do. I called Carlos as soon as it was a reasonable hour. I want to go ahead with pressing charges, I told him when he picked up. Not just for me, but to make sure Gabriel can't do this to anyone else. I could hear the approval in Carlos's voice as he responded. I think that's a wise decision, Maria. I'll start the process right away. Over the next few weeks, my life became a whirlwind of legal meetings, paperwork, and preparations. Carlos and his team worked tirelessly, building an airtight case against Gabriel. I threw myself into the process, determined to see it through. It wasn't easy. There were days when the stress and emotional toll threatened to overwhelm me. On those days, I'd walk down to the beach, let the sound of the waves wash over me, and remind myself why I was doing this. One afternoon, about a month after my meeting with Carlos, I received a call from him. Maria, he said, his voice tight with excitement. We've got him. The DA has agreed to take the case. They're issuing an arrest warrant for Gabriel as we speak. I felt a rush of emotions, relief, vindication, and a twinge of sadness for what could have been. Thank you, Carlos, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For everything. Don't thank me yet, he replied. This is just the beginning. Are you ready for what comes next? I took a deep breath. I am, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Whatever it takes. The next day, I woke up to breaking news. Gabriel had been arrested. His face was plastered all over the local news channels, looking shell-shocked as he was led away in handcuffs. I watched, feeling strangely detached, as if I was watching a movie about someone else's life. The story unfolded quickly after that. As news of Gabriel's arrest spread, other victims came forward. It turned out that I wasn't the only one he had deceived and defrauded. There was a string of broken hearts and empty bank accounts trailing behind him. I received calls from reporters, wanting my side of the story. At first, I was hesitant to speak publicly. But then I remembered Elena's words about stopping Gabriel from hurting others. If sharing my story could help even one person avoid falling into the same trap, it would be worth it. So I agreed to an interview with a respected local journalist. We met at a quiet cafe near the beach, away from the media frenzy surrounding the courthouse. As I recounted my story, from the early days of my relationship with Gabriel to the night he left me on the side of the road, to the revelations that followed, I felt a sense of catharsis. Looking back, the journalist asked, her eyes kind but probing, were there any signs? Anything you wish you had noticed earlier? I thought carefully before answering. There were little things, I said slowly. Moments when something felt off. But love can make you overlook a lot. I don't blame myself for not seeing it sooner. What's important is that I saw it eventually, and I took action. The interview was published the next day. The response was overwhelming. I received messages from people all over Santa Barbara and beyond, sharing their own stories of deception and fraud, thanking me for speaking out. It was a lot to process. I found myself retreating to the empty rooms of my house, seeking solitude to make sense of everything that was happening. The house that had once felt like a prison of memories now felt like a sanctuary. One evening, as I sat on the floor of what used to be our bedroom, surrounded by the echoes of my past life, I had an epiphany. This house, this shell that Gabriel had tried to take from me, could be more than just my home. It could be a fresh start, not just for me, but for others who had been through similar ordeals. The idea took root and grew. What if I turned this house into a safe haven? A place where people who had been victims of fraud or deception could come to heal, to learn, to rebuild their lives. Excited by the possibility, I called Elena to share my idea. She listened quietly as I explained my vision, my words tumbling out in a rush. Maria, she said when I finally paused for breath. That's amazing. But are you sure? This is a big undertaking. I looked around the empty room, seeing not what was missing, but what could be. I'm sure, I said. This feels right. Like this is what I'm meant to do. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay. If this is what you want, I'm with you. Where do we start? That night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep from the excitement of my new plan, I thought about how far I'd come. From the woman left stranded on the side of the road, broken and betrayed, to someone ready to turn her pain into purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. The legal proceedings against Gabriel were just beginning, and transforming the house would take time and resources. But for the first time in a long time, I felt truly alive, truly myself. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a silent promise to myself and to all the others out there who had been deceived and betrayed. We would rise. We would rebuild. And we would be stronger than ever. The empty house would be empty no more. It would be filled with hope, healing, and new beginnings. And so would I. The weeks following my decision to transform the house into a safe haven were a whirlwind of activity. Elena, true to her word, threw herself into helping me bring my vision to life. We spent countless hours researching similar programs, drafting plans, and reaching out to potential partners and supporters. One sunny Saturday morning, as we sat at my kitchen counter surrounded by notebooks and laptops, Elena looked up at me with a mischievous glint in her eye. "You know," she said, "we should really give this place a name. Something meaningful." I paused, considering her words. "You're right," I agreed. "But what?" We bounced ideas back and forth for a while, but nothing felt quite right. Then, as I was refilling our coffee cups, it hit me. "Phoenix House," I said softly. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Phoenix House?" I nodded, feeling more certain with each passing second. "Yes. Like the phoenix rising from the ashes. It's about rebirth, about creating something beautiful and strong from destruction." A slow smile spread across Elena's face. "Phoenix House," she repeated. "I love it." With a name in place, our project felt more real than ever. We created a website, started a social media campaign, and began reaching out to local businesses and community leaders for support. The response was overwhelming. It seemed like everyone in Santa Barbara had either been touched by fraud themselves or knew someone who had been. As Phoenix House began to take shape, my life fell into a new rhythm. My days were filled with meetings, planning sessions, and overseeing the renovations of the house. The empty rooms that had once felt so oppressive were now brimming with possibility. But even as I threw myself into this new chapter of my life, the shadow of Gabriel's upcoming trial loomed large. The date was set for 3 months from now, and as it approached, I found my anxiety growing. One evening, about a month before the trial was set to begin, I received an unexpected call from Carlos. "Maria," he said, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. "I think you need to come down to the office. There's something you need to see." Intrigued and a little nervous, I drove down to Carlos's office. When I arrived, I found him and Victor huddled around a computer screen, their faces illuminated by its glow. "What's going on?" I asked as I approached. Carlos looked up, a triumphant smile on his face. "We've got him," he said. "We've really got him this time." He turned the screen towards me, and I leaned in to look. What I saw made my heart race. It was an email chain between Gabriel and his mistress, dating back several years. In it, they discussed their plans in detail, how they would manipulate me, how they would get their hands on my inheritance, how they would disappear together once they had what they wanted. "How did you get this?" I whispered, my eyes glued to the screen. Victor spoke up. "We've been monitoring Gabriel's online activities since the arrest. He's been using a burner phone to communicate with her. We managed to intercept these emails." I read through the emails, feeling a mixture of disgust and vindication. Every loving word Gabriel had ever said to me, every promise he'd made, it had all been a lie, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to manipulate me. "This changes everything," Carlos said, his voice gentle. "With this evidence, there's no way Gabriel can claim innocence. He's going away for a long time, Maria." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. After a moment, I managed to ask, "What about her? His partner in all this?" Carlos's smile turned grim. "Oh, we're not forgetting about her. She's just as culpable in all this. We're building a case against her as we speak." As I drove home that night, my mind was reeling. I'd thought I'd come to terms with Gabriel's betrayal, but seeing it laid out so coldly in those emails had reopened wounds I thought had healed. When I got home, I found Elena waiting for me. One look at my face, and she knew something was up. "What happened?" she asked, leading me to the couch. I told her everything about the emails, about Gabriel's mistress, about how they'd been planning this for years. Elena listened, her face a mixture of shock and anger. "Those bastards," she muttered when I finished. Then she looked at me, her eyes blazing with determination. "But you know what? This is good. This is exactly what we needed to nail them to the wall." I nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. "You're right," I said. "It's time to turn the tables on them once and for all." The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings and preparations. Carlos and his team worked tirelessly, building an ironclad case against both Gabriel and his mistress. I was called in for depositions, asked to recount every detail of my life with Gabriel. It was exhausting and emotionally draining, but I drew strength from the progress we were making with Phoenix House. Every time I felt overwhelmed by the legal proceedings, I'd throw myself into work on the house. Slowly but surely, it was transforming from an empty shell into a warm, welcoming space. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. I woke up early, my stomach in knots. As I got dressed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was a far cry from the broken, betrayed wife I'd been just a few months ago. This woman was strong, determined, ready to face whatever came her way. Elena picked me up, and we drove to the courthouse together. The place was swarming with reporters. Gabriel's case had become somewhat of a sensation in Santa Barbara. As we pushed our way through the crowd, I heard my name being called out, saw camera flashes going off around me. Inside, the courtroom was packed. I took my seat next to Carlos, my heart racing. And then, there he was. Gabriel, being led in by guards. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw a flicker of something in his fear, perhaps? Regret. Whatever it was gone in an instant, replaced by the smooth, charming mask I'd come to recognize as his true face. The trial began, and I listened as the prosecution laid out their case. They presented financial records showing Gabriel's fraud, testimonies from other victims he'd conned over the years, and finally, the emails between him and his mistress. As the emails were read aloud, I watched Gabriel's facade crumble. He slumped in his seat, his face pale. His lawyer attempted to object, to claim the emails were obtained illegally, but the judge overruled him. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and stepped up to the witness stand. As I recounted my story, our marriage, his manipulation, the night he left me on the side of the road, I felt a sense of power I'd never experienced before. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a survivor, and my words were going to ensure that Gabriel could never hurt anyone else again. The trial lasted for days, but in the end, the verdict was swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts. As the judge read out Gabriel's sentence, 15 years in prison, plus restitution to all his victims, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters clamoring for a statement, I finally spoke. Today, justice was served, I said, my voice steady. But this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been deceived, manipulated, or taken advantage of. Today is the day we say, no more. As the cameras flashed around me, I continued, and to anyone out there who's been through something similar, I want you to know you're not alone. There's help, there's hope, and there's a future waiting for you. At Phoenix House, we're here to help you rise from the ashes and rebuild your life. With that, I turned and walked away, Elena by my side. As we drove home, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The chapter of my life with Gabriel was finally, truly over. But a new chapter, filled with purpose, hope, and the promise of helping others, was just beginning. And I was ready for it, ready for whatever came next. In the weeks following Gabriel's trial, I found myself in a strange state of limbo. For so long, my life had been defined by my marriage, then by its dramatic end and the ensuing legal battle. Now that it was all over, I felt both liberated and a little lost. The media frenzy around the case gradually died down, but I still found myself being recognized on the streets of Santa Barbara. People would come up to me in the grocery store or at the beach, sharing their own stories of deception and fraud. Each encounter reinforced my commitment to Phoenix House and the work we were doing. One sunny morning, about a month after the trial, I stood on the balcony of my villa, looking out over the Pacific. The view that had once been a source of contention between Gabriel and me now filled me with peace. I took a deep breath of the salty air, feeling truly at home for the first time in years. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena, "Big day today. Are you ready?" I smiled, excitement bubbling up inside me. Today was the day we were officially opening Phoenix House to its first residents. After months of hard work, planning, and renovations, we were finally ready to start helping people rebuild their lives. I arrived at Phoenix House early, wanting to make sure everything was perfect. The old villa had been transformed. The empty rooms that had once echoed with the ghosts of my failed marriage were now filled with comfortable furniture, cheerful artwork, and an atmosphere of hope. Elena was already there, directing a small army of volunteers as they put the finishing touches on everything. She beamed when she saw me. "There's our fearless leader," she called out. "Come on, there's someone I want you to meet." She led me to the kitchen, where a young woman was arranging flowers in vases. "Maria, this is Sophia. She's going to be our first resident." Sophia turned, a shy smile on her face. She couldn't have been more than 25, but there was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of hardships beyond her years. "It's nice to meet you, Maria," she said softly. I can't thank you enough for this opportunity." I took her hands in mine, feeling a surge of protectiveness. "You're so welcome, Sophia. We're here to help in any way we can." As the morning progressed, more residents arrived. Each had their own story of betrayal and loss, but they all shared a common thread: a determination to move forward, to reclaim their lives. Watching them settle in, seeing the tentative friendships forming, I felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything I'd experienced before. The official opening ceremony was a small, intimate affair. We'd invited some local officials and community leaders, as well as the reporters who had covered my story from the beginning. As I stood up to give my speech, I looked out over the gathered crowd and felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. "Welcome to Phoenix House," I began. "This place, it's more than just a building. It's a promise. A promise that no matter how dark things seem, there's always hope. A promise that you're not alone, that there are people who understand what you're going through and want to help." I paused, looking around at the faces of our first residents. I know what it's like to feel betrayed, to have your world turned upside down. But I also know the strength that can come from that experience. Each one of us here has a phoenix inside, waiting to rise from the ashes. And together, we're going to help that phoenix take flight. The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions, tours, and heartfelt conversations. By the time the last guest left and the residents had retired to their rooms, I was exhausted but exhilarated. Elena found me in the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea. "Well," she said, plopping down in the chair across from me. "We did it." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "We really did." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm so proud of you, Maria. Look at what you've created out of all that pain. You're amazing, you know that." I felt tears prick at my eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, Elena. You've been my rock through all of this." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our tea and reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. Finally, Elena stood up with a yawn. "I should head home. Big day tomorrow, our first full day of operations." After she left, I found myself wandering through the quiet house. In each room, I saw not just the physical transformations we'd made, but the potential for emotional and psychological healing. This house that had once been a symbol of my pain was now a beacon of hope for others. I ended up on the balcony, looking out at the moonlit ocean. The night was clear, the stars twinkling brightly above. As I stood there, I thought about how far I'd come. From the woman left stranded on the side of the road, to the one standing here now, strong and independent, ready to help others find their way. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Phoenix House quickly gained a reputation as a place of healing and empowerment. We expanded our services, offering counseling, financial literacy classes, and job placement assistance. Each success story, each person who left Phoenix House stronger and more confident than when they arrived, felt like a personal victory. One evening, about 6 months after we opened, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in my office, going over some paperwork, when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," I called out, not looking up from my desk. "Hello, Maria." I froze. I knew that voice. Slowly, I raised my head to see Carlos standing in the doorway, a small smile on his face. "Carlos," I exclaimed, jumping up to greet him. "What are you doing here?" He chuckled, stepping into the office. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. See how things are going." We spent the next hour catching up. Carlos filled me in on the aftermath of Gabriel's trial. Apparently, he was doing his time quietly, no appeals or trouble. His mistress had taken a plea deal and was serving a shorter sentence. As we talked, I realized how much I'd missed Carlos's steady presence, his quiet strength. When he finally stood to leave, I found myself reluctant to see him go. "You know," he said, pausing at the door, "I'm really impressed with what you've done here, Maria. You've turned your pain into something beautiful, something that's helping a lot of people." I felt a blush creep up my cheeks at his praise. "Thank you, Carlos. That means a lot coming from you." He nodded, then hesitated for a moment. "Listen, I was wondering, would you like to grab dinner sometime? To celebrate all you've accomplished?" I blinked, surprised by the invitation. Then, slowly, I felt a smile spread across my face. "You know what? I'd like that very much." As I watched Carlos drive away, I felt a flutter of excitement in my chest. For the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to the future not just as a helper or an advocate, but as Maria, a woman ready to embrace life and all its possibilities. That night, as I stood on my balcony looking out at the ocean, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the hard-won victories. Each step, no matter how difficult, had led me to this moment. I was no longer defined by what had happened to me, but by what I had chosen to do with it. Phoenix House was more than just a refuge for those who had been betrayed. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of turning pain into purpose. As I gazed at the stars twinkling above the Pacific, I felt a deep sense of peace wash over me. I was free from the shadows of my past, free to write my own story. And that story, I knew, was just beginning. The cool night breeze caressed my face, carrying with it the salty scent of the ocean and the promise of new beginnings. I took a deep breath, feeling truly alive. Whatever the future held, I was ready for it. Ready to live, to love, to grow. Ready to soar on my phoenix wings, rising ever higher into the boundless sky of possibility.